shares upwards, might actually stumble across some good stuff. I wanted a discussion because looking out, it's been interesting week on week as you know we go through the experience of working from home, trying to get the tech working, trying to figure out what the customers are about, trying to figure out what the employees are reacting to, who's furloughed, who's not, who's in business, who's not, etc., etc. There's literally a breaking story every single week. And I think the day that I decided to get this one together was the day when the Chancellor was talking about yet another round of, I think, kicking furlough, the money for it, further down the year. And some of the numbers around a recession came through. And I just thought this is probably the next big topic that we all need to get our heads around of and wonder what the consequences of that are. And indeed, from a service perspective, how are we now going to cope as far as this is concerned? So hence the title, hence the invitation, and the ability to explore today. I'm delighted actually who has turned up, because I think we've got a fairly rich group in terms of experience and expertise. And the reason for choosing Zoom as opposed to anything else is I really do like the fact that you can have this as a voice-based discussion as opposed to just a text one. I mean, I don't know how many webinars I've done over the last decade, but I find them very formulaic and very sort of presenter-centric and rather passive, to be honest. And I have really enjoyed the fact that Zoom, although it can be slightly chaotic, is also pretty interesting in terms of the ability to get a conversation happening in a virtual way. So what I'm hoping for is to get you to do a little bit of thinking, and I've certainly provided a few slides just to guide the conversation, but we've got regular points of punctuation across the remainder of the hour that we've got. And that's really where I would like us to share experience and thoughts in terms of what we think is going to be happening, and indeed if we're currently responsible for running a brand, what we think we're going to do in response to that. There are some people that I haven't actually directly invited, but I know are sitting there from an even broader perspective of working with many organizations, whether either in tech or consulting or something like that. And again, I think that's going to be very useful to take a broader perspective and say, what are we hearing? Because at the moment, one of the interesting things for me is that things definitely are changing. As opposed to just talking about change, it really is taking place. So I think one of the most valuable things of turning up on yet another Zoom session is to see whether or not there's anything that calibrates with what we've understood, or indeed any new ideas that get folded into our own thought process. So as that is a scene setter, let me see if I can get my screen sharing to do what it's meant to do and get our conversation going. On Seth's advice, who's my mentor, by the way, in terms of making this work, I have got a couple of screens going. So hopefully I will stay in sync in terms of moving through the particular slides, and I will wait for a little bit in terms of in case there's just a wee bit of a lag. But the exam question today is, have you got a plan? Have you thought about the recession, how that's going to impact you as a service leader? If you want to go broader than that and talk about CX, talk about marketing, I think the conversation absolutely applies as much. So don't get too hooked on that. First conversation for me, though, is to do with outlook and looking at the numbers. And I think one of the quick points to make about this is how long do we believe, in terms of risk management anyway, that we're going to be looking into some form of recession. I think the optimistic perspective a while back was that we were going to have one of these nicely shaped V things, which meant that we went down but bounced back pretty quickly. If you think about it, a U is just a V taking a bit longer to happen. So there's that kind of a shape. Or indeed, we might do a double dip, which is what a W looks like. Or we might do a Japanese thing, and apparently they're already now technically into recession, and you just slide gracefully into some form of decline, although they are still the third largest on the planet in terms of an economy, over a contracted period of time. And one of the things that Peter contributed to this discussion, Mr. Massey, was a nice little slide from McKinsey, who again have got a great knack of summarizing things well. And their argument would be to say, well, it depends on two dynamics really. One is how effective we believe the public health response is going to be, or has been so far. And the second thing is how effective we believe one's government is in terms of the associated economic policy. And if you take those two particular dynamics, then we can refer back to the V and the W and the U shape. And clearly, if you look at everything sitting in B, are not really things that we would welcome. There's your W on B5. There's your lapse into poverty on B3. There's another version of a B4 is another version of a W, but it never quite completely recovers, and B2 doesn't completely recover, and neither does B1. So if we're lucky, we're hoping for the best of all outcomes would be if we have effective government and effective health policy, you end up with that V shape. If it's not quite so effective in terms of government response, it might take longer, and that's your U shape. And then down the bottom there, as you can see, well, actually, A1 is a recovery, although it's not a straightforward one at the end of the day. Neither is A2 at the end of the day. So taking that as a baseline, if you want, to consider how we as a country and also as organizations are going to respond, I think it's pretty inevitable that CFOs are going to be responding with some form of cost cutting, at the end of the day. And if you look at it from the perspective of being CFO of the country, then already we have spent a tremendous amount of money, billions, in terms of the consequences on tax loss, and some of the generous schemes that have been put out there. And I think what's interesting, of course, is that we've got 1 in 5 people right now, 20% of the workforce furloughed. And of course, the decision on that has been delayed out until October time. But once that money is withdrawn and that support, how do we think organizations are going to respond? And taking probably one of the most dramatically impacted marketplaces, which is travel, then TUI has already demonstrated what might be one of the ways of behaving as an organization when you're most seriously impacted so far. So there's a little bit of grist for the mill. So the first thing I would like to do is to just get some initial response from you in terms of a poll. And I think, no, let's have a look. Let me just relaunch that. So let's see if that turns up on the screen. There you go. So asking yourself the question from your own organization or those that you are aware of, if you've got a slightly broader perspective, what's the status of corporate cost cutting at the moment coming out of lockdown? Are we in an already started space, still being planned, nothing official but expected, no intention of cutting costs? There are, by the way, some marketplaces, and I think probably some technology companies and healthcare companies would see themselves in this space in a growth and investment mode, in which case things are distinctly hunky-dory. So, okay, we've got our responses now. I'll just give you another couple of seconds on that, and I'll feed you back the answers in a sec. So there we go. That's probably about as many as we're going to get. Right, there we go. Let me feed that with you, back to you. So actually halfway already started, another third still being planned, the remaining 15, nothing expected. Couple of us, no intention of cutting costs, nobody's particularly in growth mode. Okay, so it's an unfolding story, let's put it like that. That's great, thank you very much for that. So let me just move on now. So coming out of that, consequences are squeeze on budgets. The conversation today is primarily about service, but I guess it could apply to CX, it can apply to marketing, it can probably apply all across the board at the end of the day. And my next question, therefore, guess what, is going to be, what do we think the impact of that is going to be on service budgets? Again, what's your best bet for the next period of time, however you look at your budgets? You're going to be lucky enough to have it same as now, or are you anticipating some level of reduction? And the guess, and again, if you already know it, please put it in, but if not, do your best guess in terms of what we're looking at right now. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Oh, we've got a bit of jiggling around in terms of changing views there, which is interesting. Right. Yes, James made an interesting comment there. Local government has actually been in this space for the last decade. Okay, so here we go. Let me just share those results with you. So, I don't know, not exactly a sweet spot, but the consensus seems to be around about anywhere between 10 to 20% reduction, maybe. Some people seeing a little bit more than that. Okay, so there is going to be significant reduction in one form or the other. It'd be interesting to map that back to individual industries, obviously, but we can see the consequence. So the point being is that that is going to change us in terms of what we're able to do. So my conclusion is that we're therefore confronted with this new challenge. We've always had it out there, but it's going to become much more focused and much more severe for us, which is that, of course, we're desperate to stick with the customer experience, but it's going to have to be delivered at a much lower cost. And bearing in mind that in many service environments, one of the premium costs are the people. So how are we going to actually get through that at the end of the day? And this is the point where I'd like to now come back into a discussion. Again, I have captured those of you that have offered up questions. So again, Peter on this particular one, I can remember, said, you know, what have we learnt from previous cycles of recessions, and maybe what's going to be completely unique about this particular one at the end of the day. And I'd like us to spend a wee bit of time doing that. I think because I can see everybody on the screen, if you don't mind me being a bit teacherish, and if you want to put your hand up like that so I can see it, that will mean I can introduce you, and we probably won't have quite so many clashes in terms of everybody wanting to speak at the same time. But again, comments, observations, personal intentions on that. Who would like to kick in first of all? Peter Massey, thank you.
There we go, get it off mute. Yeah, just some observations. I've been through a couple of recessions. Obviously, there is quite a lot of data about correlation between customer sat or NPS and, you know, the very top end of that and doing well economically through recession. I can think of a lovely case study that Porsche did at that top end sensitivity, you know, the spending even at the top end being very sensitive, but actually the dealerships that had got very high sat kept the money flowing. The other key thing I'd just lob in is something I was taught in the first recession I went through in '90 when I was running a business. And that was one, batten down the hatches early. Don't wait to see what's going to happen. You know, you can read the runes, so act early. Second was, always stuck in my mind, was the sword of Damocles. You know, that kind of, oh my God, there's a sword waiting to fall on you kind of feeling, is that if you're going to do cuts, do them as deep as you need to in one go and reassure the people who remain. Otherwise, you will lose your top talent.
Yeah.
And you're very, very clear about that. And then the third point is cash is king, is that there's no point discounting your services or your goods during a recession because you're chasing business. Because all you do is occupy your best people for stuff that's not making money. So don't try and discount your way to volume during a recession, because it's a sure way to go fall down that dip. Yeah. So those are the things I was taught anyway.
And since you introduced those two comments, what do you think this time round is going to be unique from the ones that you've seen before?
I think the globality of it, so everybody at once. So if I think over the 2008-10 period, Asia and Australia, my colleagues over there didn't suffer the same degree, and there was somewhere else to go, the market shift to. This looks like it's going to be global, and everybody's in the same boat. So it's going to be interesting to see, will there be winners and losers, or just everybody sort of bumping along? And certainly, probably all of us have read that lovely paper called The Hammer and the Dance about trying to cope with the COVID crisis, that it's quite likely to bobble along. It's not going to go away in a hurry. And therefore, I suspect the economies will do somewhat the same. It may come back as we get used to things, but it will bubble along. And finally, to a point that you made, quite a lot of clients are doing really, really well in this. So this is a very divergent set of markets.
It's very polarized. I think some markets have had a terrible time, and some are thriving. And it's quite an extreme contrast. Lee, did you just put your hand up?
I did. I'm now off mute. And you're right. I think there are. I'm seeing quite a lot of organisations that are doing very well. And my view on it, as a marketer would have this kind of view, is very optimistic. I think there are a lot of opportunities out there. And as service leaders, I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that you're working with the most profitable customers, make sure you're looking after your customers. And I think, as Peter said, not discounting, because that's just going to hurt you later. But the decisions that you make now are the ones that are going to ride you through. So one of the things I shared on LinkedIn the other day was the decisions you take now should be aimed at a goal that you've set post-recession, and that you're gearing yourself up for that. I'd be a fool to say that you shouldn't cut your marketing budgets, because cash is king. You need to have the cash. But I think there is an opportunity for us it's just an opportunity for us to be more efficient, to focus on the right things, to focus on the most profitable customers, and to focus on the future post-recession.
Well said. So, Jane, please.
So I'll probably come at this from a completely different angle from everybody else, but my background was around using customer contact centres in the very early days, 20 years ago, to transform public services. And we don't have the luxury in local government or even central government to leave people behind. And so consequently, in this period of extreme pressure on resources, we've gone through 10 years of austerity, where we've been pared to the bone. People have been tremendously inventive. We're taking bigger risks than we usually do. But somehow the technology and the capability of contact centres, customer services, to connect local people with local people, particularly if we're going to go to more remote working, virtualised working, somehow your industry, which serves particular clients, the skills that are involved in that have kind of been lost somewhere in policy world. We're talking digital as the new nirvana, disruptive change, but people have forgotten the basic traction that happens when people speak to other people using this wealth of technology, which is already embedded safely and securely within contact center platforms, but somehow it's being seen as old hat and not digital. So one of the other groups I'm involved with is the Public Sector Transformation Academy, and we're looking at the 3 horizons approach to change, which is looking at the past and saying, what will we ditch, what will we keep, what's happening in the current situation, what changes can we see, and what do we need to sort of almost design back in for a new and better future. So it's this build back better conversation, which may not be your bottom line, it might not be your immediate concern, but I think your industry has a fundamental role to play in that.
Scott, thank you for that. Scott, by the way, quick view on the consumer. 1 in 5 furloughed, presumably going to have less money in their pockets potentially. Are they still spending?
They are with us, yeah, but they're spending differently. So I can, at this time, spring, we'd be selling a lot of swimwear, dresses, that kind of thing. It's completely turned upside down. So the warehouse full of dresses has suddenly have to be replaced with a warehouse full of joggers, athleisure wear, hoodies, sweats, that kind of thing. But we're an agile business, so we've managed to do that. So we've kind of, the phrase is pivot, isn't it? That's become pretty commonplace these days, but we've managed to do that. But also what we've seen is a big jump in international trade. So the UK is still relatively depressed compared to where it was, we're seeing new growth territories. So, for example, Poland has gone really big for us. The USA has gone really big for us, even though it's in probably a more severe lockdown than some other places. It's growing quite significantly. I think the challenge we face as a retailer. So I think, I can talk honestly on this call, but we've probably fared better than most. But everything's so much more expensive now.
Yeah.
So all the stuff we sent to the USA used to go below people. It was on commercial flights. As soon as you take out 90% of your commercial flights, and your capacity goes out the air, your costs increase quite significantly. So the cost of getting it over from China or wherever it might be, and then the cost of shipping it out to the US, everything has just gone sky high. So that's a consideration really for us in terms of the revenues there, but everything's more expensive to serve that revenue.
Yes.
So that's it from a consumer. From a service perspective, we've seen a big shift to social. And that's probably because that's where people are living their lives. So certainly our customers have always lived their lives on social, but they're doing it 24/7 now rather than, for half the day.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more social engagement, and consequently there's a lot more contacts via social. So that's gone up now to almost half our contacts.
Wow. That's interesting. So your consumer profile, just so everybody knows, is roughly from what to what?
Typically 16 to 29-year-old women.
Yeah.
As a rule, bit around the edges, but that's what we describe as the bullseye customer.
Yeah.
So social is quite. I mean, volumes are up, sales volumes are up, but also contact volumes are up. Not as much as some places, I don't think, but we're probably about 20% up on the run rate that we were seeing pre-lockdown in terms of volumes.
Okay, so there's a retail story that is a tick in the box. Chris, you were saying earlier on, in the travel space, that's been extremely challenging. Yeah, and that's a difficult thing at the end of the day. Lee, you're being evidence-based optimist in terms of you can see some opportunity sitting there at the end of the day, and there's a vibe that people are saying also that there is as much opportunity as possibly threat, sitting out there, albeit that there is definitely change in the air in terms of what the priorities are, and all the rest of it. I would just put one thing into the pot, is given where that little poll gave us in terms of the cost cutting and everything, if we have this conversation again in a month, I'm sure that, would be a more developed organizational strategy. I still think that probably most of us haven't thought through some of the consequences of this. And I think that there's going to be a very interesting thing that happens when the furlough cash runs out. And I think when we get to October time, it will be interesting to see how organizations behave at that particular point in time. In fact, the cynics are already saying that the reason why maybe the government have been so keen to expose us to this, getting out there again, is of course to try to encourage us as fast as we can back into there, because we have, quote unquote, a nation addicted to being furloughed. In other words, the government pays for us. It's a new form of that. So it'll be interesting to see how that 20% and which parts of the market that's most affected by, and indeed whether or not certain sectors actually get back up on, into a healthy state, or they remain either under par or indeed don't take place at all. It will be interesting to see what happens there. Time ticks on, so I'm going to move on to another section of conversation, if that's okay with everyone, and move into a new conversation sort of sitting on the back of that. And by the way, if given the conversation on a particular topic, nobody's really that animated, that's fine. We'll just move on to the next one. But one thing I have heard a lot about is that certainly contact center specifically, there has been a massive uptick in terms of digital transformation. Actually, it's not true. It's broader than that. People have suddenly gone, this is a big challenge. We need to do something about it quickly. If I had not done, I don't know, cloud-based engagement infrastructure, I'm probably thinking about that very seriously right now. If I hadn't done sort of self-service knowledge management, I'm probably thinking about that very seriously. And I'm hearing about lots of teams getting out there, doing lots of things in their agile way without the usual excuses from those on high that say, where's the ROI, where's the risk, we don't think we'll do it today, we've got other priorities, etc. And many people have said, we've managed to achieve in just this very short space of time what would probably have taken, you know, a good number of years to have done. And if you look at automation in all its forms, it was already brewing very nicely anyway. And I suspect that one of the places that people will try to argue for further investment in this period of time, you know, is going to be into further levels of automation, simply because it's understandable, the referenceability is strong, generally speaking, the commercial benefits are pretty obvious. And by the way, from the point of view of using your best assets, which are your people, in an intelligent way, it clearly doesn't work to use them to do low-level repetitive work. Automation is pretty much, you know, a self-evident opportunity sitting there. And again, to just answer a couple of questions which were submitted, you know, how are we going to maximize efficiency when we're probably going to have lower staff and budgets? And you know, are others doing more automation since lockdown? I thought, again, we could just pause for a period there and reflect on that general opportunity around of trying to take things away from, you know, sticky glue and humans and all that kind of stuff, and really make workflow automated, digital, and effective. And really, I'm not just talking about the touch point called call center, I'm talking about end to end. And what are people's experience around of seeing an acceleration or a decrease in that? And what's your feeling about looking into the future, whether or not that's going to be a major theme? Michelle, love to hear that.
So I must admit that I've seen quite the opposite here with us in South Africa. So yes, there's the whole thing around remote work. So if you want to put that in digital, but our biggest challenge currently with regards to customer experience is dealing with legislative and regulatory changes. So not so, yes, that might involve digital, but the focus is more around regulation and competent regulation. And I mean, with regards to retail, we don't have the option now to refund anymore. People can't bring things back, clothes back when they, so that, and I don't know necessarily if digital is going to solve those legislative issues for us. Okay. So just my feedback.
Back to that, Chris.
Yeah, I think homework is an interesting one. So I you know, worked at home for many years in various companies, but when I got to Trip Tees, even though all of our technology is cloud-based, there was no reason for anyone to be in an office. We didn't need to, there was no need technically. However, the ethos was, and the culture was, get into the office. We work better together. We trust each other better, all the rest of it. So there was a real push for everyone to be in the office. And then as soon as COVID started and we all just switched from home straight away without any technical problems, as I explained, suddenly it became, actually, this is a lot easier. This is not a big problem. And we were almost immediately looking to get out and stop our leases. We had expensive leases in New York, Singapore and London. And kind of almost like in the first 2 weeks, we were like, let's get rid of these. We want to cut, we can cut so much cost here by getting rid of these. So it kind of like, you know, I think the same experiences happen. I know my wife's working from home. She's never done it before. And she had quite a lot of technical challenges to get there. Now she's done it. She's fully self-sufficient. She's got the 2 screens and it's easy, right? So I think there'll be tons and tons of companies now who will enable that, have enabled it, and therefore it will change for the future.
Well, I must say, having been traveling to London for the 30 years, you know, and always seeing cranes building buildings, it makes you wonder whether or not you're ever going to see that, you know, take place in quite the same way again at the end of the day. Craig, you wanted to chip in there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of automation, and certainly it's something my company does, but I more have a concern around it that people are going to rush to implement something badly and not actually sort out their processes behind it. So for me, one of the things that successful companies do as they come out of a recession is actually they look at good old-fashioned kind of process optimization. So some of the big things that have been done in the past, like lean, Kaizen, and all of these kind of efforts, to actually make your processes as good as possible, as efficiently and cheaply as possible, and then look at what you automate after that. I think we're gonna maybe run into a few issues and a bit of bad PR if we're rushing in to automate everything when actually the payback just isn't there on everything.
Well, there's certainly a truth that if you automate rubbish, you get just faster rubbish.
Yeah.
So you've got to combine the two things together. I would agree with that. Simon. Simon. Yep.
Just unmuting myself. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Thorpe, and then we'll do Mr. Waldron.
Simon off. Yeah, just to jump off what Craig was saying there, I think one of the concerning things I've seen is a lot of companies start questioning the value of things like customer insight and switching off, things like surveys, stopping asking customers for opinions and thought processes. And my concern is if we completely disconnect from customers because we think we already know the answers, then on Craig's point, we'll start making decisions based on the company rather than the overall customer experience. And we'll start, making decisions in the wrong ways. So I think the two have got to jump, and run in tandem. And if we're kind of locking that away, I think that presents a concern. Yes,
no, I agree with that. I can hear that. Simon, did you actually want to say anything, Mr. Waldron? No? Okay, Seth, let's go for you, please.
So there's an additional aspect here. Our enterprises are supposed to be customer-centric, and we have to recognize that customers' expectations, including for how they are going to interact with our organizations, are changing. Because customers are also using Zoom, they're also using electronic means, their expectations will be changing. So, and I'll give you a quotation here from the ice hockey great Wayne Gretzky, who said, "Don't skate to where the puck has been, skate to where it's going."
Mm. Yep, absolutely. Peter, were you inspired to have an observation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just to illustrate Seth's point is my wife's a vet, and she didn't think she could treat dogs over Zoom, but she can, and very successfully. And so it's quite interesting just how those shifts in behaviour work. But there's a bit of an elastic band there. We're based in Northern Ireland at the moment where we lock down, and consequently we've just changed the rules, I think, yesterday, and she's allowed out and can travel again. So she's probably going to go into the surgery next week because there's something about the way her view of work is. And I think for a lot of customers and people, there will be this elastic going on where people default back once they can. The most interesting cases I've seen already are all in the government sector. So somebody we know who's an immunologist has been forced to go into the office because the data is secure. One of the government agencies we work with, they've still got people not allowed to work from home because the data is sensitive and secure. And again, in the health service, really strangely, but in the health service, people who don't need to be office under pressure to go into the office already. So I think we're going to see again, this is the polarization thing where we're going to get a sort of camp of people who already work from home, already had all the kit, will do more of it, but people will still want to meet. We'll have a camp in the middle where some of the senior leaders have had their minds changed, and consequently there'll be much more working from home in those organizations. And certainly in the client group that I facilitate, we had this discussion last week, a number of very large organizations are talking about 80-90% from home and getting rid of the current estate and getting hub offices in place. Then you've the other end, which will be on the end of that piece of elastic. They'll try and go back to physical space.
Yeah. And it's no coincidence that some very large CEOs of the banks have said, we can do it from the kitchen now. Why have we got these places down in Canary Wharf? So, as an early warning sign for negotiating with those landlords, which will be interesting. Carol, thank you.
Hi. One of my observations that makes me slightly nervous is we've overcome the objections from our exec around working from home because we've had to do it, and they're all very excited that we've deployed the technology and majority of people are working from home. We're seeing a natural uplift in performance, and I think that that is a false positive but they're all over it in terms of, rather than reinvest the potential cost savings or benefits that they get from an uplift in performance back into the customer experience or the employee experience, and immediately going, this is the new normal, we can cut X amount out of the budget based on very little information.
Yes, yeah. Craig, great point, by the way. Thanks for that. Appreciate that, if everyone's got a chance to look at it. Peter Dorrington, yes.
Thanks. So, yeah, it was interesting. I'm optimistic. The technology solutions are out there. And it was not very long ago when public sector said we couldn't do anything in the cloud. And a lot of them have moved into the cloud. So it is solvable. I'm more concerned that we look at the cost of delivery of digital rather the cost savings. And the attraction is, if we don't look at what the value of a differentiated experience is, and particularly the human element of that, then automation becomes the hammer where everything else looks like a nail.
Right.
And one of the things I did was I looked at the emotional outlook for the country, and we're not going to be facing the kind of market we got. Yep, some people have been relatively insulated from what's going on, but a lot of people are very distressed, anxious, uncertain. You know, they may not have money. So even if we open the doors, they won't necessarily walk through. And I can see us, and I think this is a point somebody else made, we pile on the pressure on digital because it's operationally we've had to do it, and suddenly people think it's a panacea, and it absolutely isn't. There are times when it works really well, but it's not a hammer for every nail, every transaction. And I'm particularly concerned, as I say, it's about the more vulnerable members of our society that are actually probably going to be a bigger subset than they have been previously, because this doesn't work very well for them. And I think I've shared the view, I've never come across an emotive bot, you know, one that could actually understand and truly empathize with people. So that was my point of view. I think there's the classical economic view, you know, whether it's VW or whatever it might be, they say, well, yeah, it's just the money. But we're dealing with a population globally, I think, which is very unsettled, and they're going to need different things. You know, I've talked about quite a lot. People are going to need some reassurance. They're going to need some comfort that things will go back to normal. Because I'm not sure that even if a retailer can open their door in a bricks and mortars environment, people are queuing up to walk through.
So the two Peters actually representing interesting points. One being the elastic effect, habit takes us back. The other one being Peter's perspective that maybe we're going to have to be patient with people to get that habit kicked in again, and have to see what takes place. Okay, I'm going to move on. I know we could just stick with that, but I'm going to move on and just see if there's some more stuff we can cover off as time moves on. So we're back into this conversation. It's a little bit more now. A bit of a favorite one, you know, the relationship between when do we do humaning, when do we do digital, and all of that stuff. And for me, I've presented this many, many times over, you know, the speed at which we have moved away from using people inappropriately for live assisted service to a future where I don't think we need more than a quarter of all engagements require humans, as defined by when it's emotive, when it's complex, and when it matters to the relationship. And yet the speed at which we've gotten there has been not the fastest over the last 10 years. And I think a key question, if we are looking to try to use our budgets effectively and try to rebalance what we're doing in our service environments, is how can we get to a point where we are doing as much of the self-service and the proactive as we know that we could and we should be doing, you know, at the end of the day. And one of the answers to that, potentially, comes in this other topic that we've yet to raise, which is AI going to turn up in time, and is AI going to really be substantive and make a difference? And one of the ways I summarize that whole discussion is to say that there is a never-ending set of relationships taking place between all our customers, all their topics that they you know, push at us, all the channels they choose to engage with us, and the outcomes that occur from our perspective as organization and from their perspective as individuals. And of course, the most interesting point right now is that the vast majority of those patterns and that data remains beneath the surface of visibility to us. And now we're in an age where we're beginning slowly from moving from pure vaporware to where our ability to see that is getting stronger and stronger. And of course, it goes right the way through from changing our ability to route, understand intent, be proactive, the ability to be able to develop humans, and a whole bunch of stuff that goes with it. And one of the things that I wonder more generally about self-service is whether or not it fails because it does not imitate what we require in terms of human to human. And one of the most interesting perspectives, I think, in this lockdown period have been all the sites that have said, sorry, you are going to have to wait longer. The queues are very long. We have a lot of people that want to speak to us. And quite frankly, we just can't scale to that. Get used to it. And it's interesting how we're going to deal with that issue, that if it remains an emotive environment, people are going to naturally gravitate to trying to get into that queue, maybe at the cost that they're going to find acceptable in terms of wait time. Against that is the ability to try to be slightly cleverer around of relevance and context. And I do think there's some opportunities coming through in terms of AI, in terms of predictive analytics, and the ability to start to personalize the recommendations and therefore make the route from my question to the solution a much lower effort and a much faster one that customers will adopt. So general questions sitting there. Making another point about that is that we are incredibly lazy for good neurological reasons as human beings. We don't like to effort too much. And just two very simple pictures to illustrate that. If you were going to try and decide where was the cure to your particular ailment on that shelf, that's cognitively difficult. That's much more simple because it's been packaged up in a way that I can relate to that and kind of understand that. And so therefore a point I want to make, particularly about self-service, coming back to transformation, which is I think a point that Craig was making earlier, is that we've got to be very careful that we don't try to rush too quickly into the whole business of self-serve and the whole business of conversational AI, because if the journeys themselves are no good, it's just going to end up in tears. Which leads me also to another conversation, and I was rather hoping that Mark Billingham might have been on the call today, but he's obviously busy. There's a picture of his particular centre up at the Very Group, previously known as Shop Direct, and they have really done some interesting things around of putting together a cross-functional team with some of those skills around of design and lean and agile and stuff like that, and are driving out some of those process and workflow and journey issues and generally continuously improving it. And if that sort of speaks to you as being something that you probably want to be taking into the future, there's another interesting thing that I've heard recently, which is if we are going to have a blended future of sometimes bricks and mortar, sometimes virtual, I've heard a number of times that you can execute on agile pretty well when you're virtual, but the business of innovating and brainstorming, a lot of people have said, is much slower simply because you haven't got the chemistry of face-to-face. And so one of the interesting issues, if we are going to be choosing between those two worlds of when is it best to do it online, and when is it best going to be face-to-face at the end of the day. So I don't know whether or not that's stimulated some thoughts, but let me just stop that particular part and come back to the group and talk generally about self-serve, proactive, AI, intelligent forms of self-serve, coupled with things like lean and all the rest of it, improving those journeys and all the rest of it, in the context of this push to be more effective around budgets. How important do we think that's going to grow? Do we think we're going to get any breakthrough on that, any transformational stuff? Because it has been a long time in the coming, and it's not really going to happen, I think, as fast as people necessarily need it. Jane, you've got your hand up first, so please go ahead.
Thank you. I think what I would say is that if the costs become the priority of your business, then the organisation becomes compliant in managing costs, and that's the experience we've seen in my industry. So it's very difficult to innovate or to challenge. And the bit that I'm losing a bit here is a lot of the conversations about end-to-end automation and all the predictive analytics and behavioural change insights kind of get lost in the machine. Who owns that? Because some of the questions that poses can be very frightening and challenging to the organisation, and quite often that just gets suppressed. So, you know, people will start behaving according to, you know, doing a good job and getting home, but actually the capabilities that everybody has at their fingertips is huge and seismic, and can make real leaps in innovation. So I think that's the tension that we've certainly experienced in my industry.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other thoughts on that? People, Lee.
I think what's become really apparent is that everything has changed. How we work has changed. What our customers expect from organizations has changed. What they're buying has changed. The processes that they now expect to go through in order to interact with an organization has changed. And therefore the needs of the technology has changed. But it's changed today, and it will change again in a week's time, and it will change again in a week's time. And going back to what Simon said, the need for the insight in order to keep on top of that change, right. And I think the need for those organizations to be agile is one of the things that I really hope isn't going to happen. Is we've seen loads of businesses be incredibly agile within the contact center space, moving to home working, but all over the world, businesses have become really agile. I really hope they retain that agility, because they're going to need to, because as it's not just the recession, and if I focus on the UK, we've got to deal with social distancing over the next 9 months or so. We've got to deal with a recession over the next 2 years or so. And we've got a little thing called Brexit on our doorstep that we've also got to deal with. So for me, everything has changed, and organizations have to adapt. Therefore, looking at the technology, I hope AI does kick in sooner, because I think we're going to need the technology in order to enable us to adapt, provided that the technology can be agile.
Sure, sure. Well said. And actually the approach to using it has to be at the end of the day. Okay, so Peter, please do. Mr. Massey.
Add a viewpoint again from the client discussion I was having last week, is that quite a lot of the organizations at the big end are less worried about the technology than they are about the critical skills of their management at a senior level. So if you've got thousands of managers, the critical thinking skills to be able to use these tools, be they AI or machine learning or whatever, is really the throttle point rather than the access to the technology.
Yes.
And I think that's partly to do with an appreciation of how to skill and how to look after the skills of large-scale organizations. We see some industries, so if you take the gaming industry, for example, where analytical thinking and analytics is totally at the front end of how they create revenue, then those organizations are moving and pivoting very, very quickly all of the time. To Lee, to your point, that's their world, that's what they do, and that's the kind of world that we're in. It's just that quite a lot of other organizations have just had a great big kick to say, come on, are you going to play this game, or are you going to go out of business?
Yeah. And you know, the kind of models that, you know, all those disruptors that we keep mentioning over and over, in reality, it boils down to the fact that they take their data seriously. They're literate about their data. They use that data and that insight to make decisions, and it's evidence-based. And on that basis, they have quite transformed kinds of businesses. And to Peter's point, the problem is, where's the talent to drive that way of working? And that probably is going to be the bottleneck. And with all those big transformations, you know, you'll recruit a third, train up a third, and lose a third if those are still the benign ways of dividing up the pie. And it might be much more difficult than that. But we're probably finding that world we were talking about in January is now, to Lee's point, needing to happen at a highly accelerated time frame. Simon Thorpe.
The other thing that fascinates me, Martin, is we as consumers and people have all had probably more time on our hands to think about the values that are important to us and the things that we want to get out of life and who we want to spend our money with and do business with. And I'm really fascinated to see what that consumer kind of expectation change looks like, because how people have and companies have reacted over this time, has been polarizing. Some have come out trumps, some have done not so well. I think, consumers will really start changing towards emotion. And I know, Martin, you're a big fan of emotion as part of that CX delivery, looking for companies that have values that represent and are equal to their own. I really do think there's going to be a shift, because people have kind of witnessed and really thought about what they want and who they want to work with.
Well, one of the most dangerous things about any form of disruption is that often people actually become conscious of their environment. And as soon as people become conscious of their environment, they might not necessarily like what they see in their environment. And so therefore, in these periods of change, you have to be super duper conscious of the impact you're making. And we already know, we don't even need to lay it down on this tape here, who has not done a good job in the last 2 months in terms of saying things about the customer and their self-interest and the world's interest. And it remains to be seen whether or not they will get punished or they won't, and we'll forgive them or not. But certainly, I think there's a new set of values that are coming through to support the point you're making there, Simon. And again, it will be interesting. I remember in the last recession, what fascinated me was the fact that customers didn't have a lot of money at the time, but brands didn't walk away from them. They actually stuck around them and they loved them. And for me, that was one of the beginning points of this whole new era in the way that people stuck, from 2008 onwards in a way that might not have been typical, in the previous generation. Right, I'm just going to probably do something I'm going to regret afterwards, but have a go at it. And that is zoom through some material very quickly, because we're about out of time. But I just wanted to get to a final point in this so everyone could see it. So we've talked tech. Just because we have to do a sequence doesn't mean I've ignored people. And I just wanted to shout out a few things. There's an interesting doc some of you might like to look at, produced by Martha Lane Fox. It's a recent thing, just prior lockdown, but it basically says there's a tremendous uptake, obviously, of digital behavior in the UK in particular. Catch up with that. My own very recent award experience of doing digital for CCMA was also a revelation in terms of some of the spaces such as housing, where they have got a very broad and deep level of digital adoption amongst their customers, right the way up to the oldest cohorts, if they have done a great job on educating and involving and co-creating with them. To Simon's point that he just made back, you've got to remember both the functional and the emotive outcome. And in a heightened state of anxiety, I think this period going forward will remain incredibly important to focus upon the emotive component of the way that we engage with customers. To make a very obvious point about happiness, some people like to use that as their lens in life. It's interesting, the connection between happy folk and productive folk at the end of the day. Playing into what we've been kind of discussing, Twitter kicked it off a couple of days ago. Stripe has also said the same thing, owned by the same person at the end of the day. It makes me wonder what we're going to see, therefore, in terms of the delivery of customer service, whether or not that is going to positively or negatively impact people at the end of the day, or what we're going to end up with in terms of a blend. On Friday, I listened into Jane Thomas's group. She's had about 50 people for the last 4 or 5 weeks, talking every Friday. And just to give you a flavor of some of that, what's been interesting is a lot of people obviously are now at home. Surprising number of people really enjoy it. One piece of evidence, which I found fascinating from the engagement surveys, is that autonomy and engagement scores have improved, possibly because line management aren't interfering in the overbossing, which is interesting. A lot of people are now saying that however we do it, the mix of home and bricks and mortar is definitely going to be, part of an ongoing mix. We're doing it slowly. We're still worried. Public transport, just incidentally, remains a huge concern for people. Most staff want choice there. And if you look into the recruitment space, again, people have got much more conscious now about the various options that are available and picking and choosing in a way that you might not have anticipated, given the fact that we probably won't have quite so many jobs to go around. So I think there's a lot in terms of thinking about the colleague side, the contribution they can make to re-architecting things, the kind of skill sets that we're going to need. I think Peter was referring to that. And also looking back out at the customer in terms of, you know, what their particular needs are going to be, and also looking at what's central to our CX strategy as far as that's concerned. I'm just going to say very quickly on the tech, again, I'm indebted to Peter's point. I'll put it in non-fruity language, but basically what is essential and what's going to remain exotic from your point of view in terms of investment. Here's an interesting point. It's a couple of years old now from PwC, but it's saying that if you track it back from the customer and from the insights that we can get from customers, then clearly, key point, worth always making, buy tech that delivers the benefits, not tech that's new and shiny. And to another point that I'm going to be talking with Peter Donington about a bit more on another session is it necessarily true that customer needs have remained the same? So is pre and post COVID, are we looking at different things? And back to the point of Simon Thorpe, maybe we want an intense scrutiny in terms of insight around of what customers are now saying are their priorities. So, you know, think good old Maslow's hierarchies, how are we rebuilding what matters to us in this new kind of world? So I think that's an important bunch of things to be thinking about. And then this brings me to where I wanted to end up our conversation, which is that I don't think it's a stretch to say that there's a whole bunch of new needs coming out of customers. Certainly organizations have got new needs that they're going to have to cater to. And I believe that we, you know, as colleagues in that relationship and role, again, have got a new set of needs, which suggests again that we've got a new set of responses in terms of behaviors, new set of ambitions, and also there's going to be a new set of enablers, some of which will be tech, but not entirely, you know, at the end of the day. And for me, going back to the question that I posed in this session, which is what, you know, what are you going to do to get through this period? I think that whilst we are normally obligated to write our plans for the next period, this is a period in which we need some fresh thinking because there are new needs and we do need to respond in new creative ways to try to get the balance between all of those things. And again, there's going to be some interesting discussions about whether or not CX, CS, all of those kinds of things thrive or die in this new period. A lot of that will be a much more commercially sharp environment in which we're going to have to be pretty nimble about arguing the benefits in terms of the impact that we can have and to try to be articulate and convincing in that particular thing, hence the reason why I actually wanted to have this conversation with us. Now, I know we're about 5 minutes over, but if nobody minds sticking around just for a wee while, maybe another 5, let's see if we can sort of bring the conversation to some kind of natural conclusion and close, either reflecting on what we've talked about so far, or from your personal perspective, what you are going to be looking at in the next period of time. Anybody want to have a quick hands up on that? Yes, Peter Massey, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, there was a comment in the chat there just about people stripping back their lives, and which I agree with. They're all experiencing somewhat of a different experience, and I think we're going to see quite a lot of stripping back of what managers do. I put a comment in there about the purpose of management has shifted. There's certainly more room, there's more trust. There has to be when you're working from home. There's a lovely saying one of my clients uses, which is, I'm not checking up, I'm just checking in.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of behavioral shift about the nature of work. What concerns me is we're going to have, if we're not careful, is trying not to be blindsided by the fact there's going to be an awful lot of people who are going to find this next period really, really painful. So social change is going to be a big background in our context. And I think we've just got to keep a very sharp eye on what's happening to people who are not in a Zoom call with a job, with a drink, etc., etc.
Well said. Yes. Chris, were you going to make a comment there?
No, not so much. I think I'd be interested if anyone has any comments on how they've been treating customers, because one of the things I mentioned at my intro was we had to quickly decide whether we were giving payment breaks. I know there was a comment about don't give discounts. Well, you know, we had to sort of really go at it, and we offered our customers payment breaks for 3 months to help them through the time, but there's only so much we can do on that, right? To keep the business going, we can give 3 months, and then we're going to expect them to pay again. And we're now going into that, right? So we've given them the payment break, and now they're obviously hotels still not opened up. There's still probably another 6 months. So we're probably going to have to hold firm on that and say, sorry, we agreed a payment break. Can you pay out? And to go with that, the next challenge that we're facing, and I think we are well ahead of it, obviously in front of a lot of other industries, is cash. The cash collection issue is actually getting the cash, and we're spending a lot of effort on that. So the customer success teams that I run or did run, where we were pivoting them into being cash collectors and helping out the finance team.
Yes, good. Mr. Waldron, can I motivate you to comment?
So really, I mean, I'm taking away from this just a lot. I think the reason I'm trying to learn from this is I think everyone's trying to predict what the future is, but actually there's so much, it's not the sort of thing where there's behaviors we can predict. You know, viruses are, we keep hearing the word invisible enemy, and it's going to leave lasting repercussions, and it's going to change consumer behavior. And I think we've just got to, the key thing we're talking about here is agility of your business. Whether it's been the home working revolution has taught people, was your tech stack fit for purpose because actually you couldn't get people to work from home? So agility of your business is key, because next time, if we have a second wave, the messages to consumers of, by the way, could you bear with us because our staff can't get into the centre? And so people go, well, why aren't you home working and all that? So we're running out of excuses. We're in the experimental stage, and we've got a forgiving audience at the moment. But actually that will wear thin in a few months' time if we haven't adapted. And it's just going to be, what are the lasting repercussions, in terms of, if we're talking about the travel industry, leisure industry, if this downsizes, what does that have in terms of behaviours to consumers in general, so that we're spending less money there? Will we push more money towards stay at home sort of events and so on? So that's the sort of thing for me, it's just to try and learn from what everyone's been talking about here. But I think what we're seeing is everyone's trying to make bets at the moment, but the only thing you can bet on is you need to be agile, because the world is unpredictable, and that's the only thing that's certain.
For sure. Jason, you've been tapping away. It'd be lovely to hear your voice just to bring things to a conclusion.
Yeah, I think, again, many people have already spoken about this. I don't see this being short term. We are going to see, as Lee was calling out there, changes week on week that drive strategic change. We're going to see a huge change in the allegiance to brands. And I think, again, it may have been Simon earlier that picked that one over. Those brands that have made short-term decisions are going to be absolutely suffering for many, many times over in terms of the impact on that customer base. I think the emotional CX, Martin, is never more needed, and we'll wait and see what that brings us to. But an incredible time ahead, and a point where opportunity will be absolutely there is no doubt, but the risk of failing against your values because you're making a short-term strategic decision is just huge. The risk of brands failing right now is massive for us all to consider.
So for me, I would conclude from that, Jason, that leadership is massively important, balancing agendas, and trying to get as much included as opposed to excluded on that agenda.
Absolutely, and the value of insight is so critical right now, and those brands that haven't had a great smooth operation, taking that insight from the front line to an operational change, are going to struggle. The agile teams that you mentioned that Mark has got in Very, and those that we had in DC, have been able to deliver change because it has been frontline, right in front, cross-working, and has done it in such a speedy manner that people have seen the valid value that has brought to the business.
Yeah.
Those businesses that haven't had that sort of footprint might find it very difficult to get going quickly now.
Jane.
I was just going to say that I'd commented quite extensively about Insight in the chat, but I think
indeed.
there's an opportunity for the for this industry to understand that there might be a different application for its talents and capabilities, which you take for granted and people actually don't know you do. So things like clinical health, social care triage, there's a whole wealth of other kinds of interactions with real people that we need to put in place, and fairly urgently, to connect people differently and use the insight from that to come up with new product and service offers.
Well said, well said. Scott, you've always got good pragmatic observations. Do you want to? Yeah.
Better not let you down then. I suppose the thing that I've learned over the last, or seen over the last 6 to 8 weeks, is just the remarkable resilience and willingness to change of an industry that I've been in for 20 years now. And I think it's adapted and made decisions things that would take 5 years sometimes to make have been done in weeks. And the amount of huge organizations I've seen suddenly working from home, you know, the partners, the people that I partner with, as an example, but, you know, large 100,000 seat contact centers literally moving to home in weeks, I just think has been phenomenal. I think the industry has done an amazing job. And that'd be my parting comment, really.
Yeah, yeah. And the upside for me on that is that the real momentum has come from that. And it would be one that we should really try and keep pushing, because there's we have a huge agenda, which I think we've been somewhat frustrated with over the years, but needs must. And we've done an amazing thing getting people into home. Now we could continue that agenda and reshape the balance, reshape the strategic role of what's taking place. And maybe we're going to find that we can't have a luxury to point to Lee just to finally consider this. Maybe the relationship between the sales, the marketing, the service component can't have the luxury of being entirely isolated any longer. And I'm sure that when the CFO does his round 3, maybe that will be one of the areas of scrutiny, and probably quite rightly so. We should look for closer relations in that respect. Lee?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think it's about time that we brought all 3 of those areas under the rightful roof of one. But I think it's, for me, what's really interesting, and it's drawing on some of the things that other people have said, this is a brilliant time to be alive, and I know that there is a lot of negative, bad experiences going on. But what we are going through now, I think that, Jason, you made the comment on the chat earlier, we will remember this forever. And I think, therefore, what will be really interesting is when we look back in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, we look back at what fundamental change did actually take place now, and how agile did we become. For me, I think it's just a great experience that what we're going through at the moment.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I shall bring matters to a conclusion. I have a happy event to go and attend now. It's my son's 38th birthday, which has completely confounded me in terms of the age. So I can tell you that it happens in a blink of an eye. And on that particular thought, I shall leave you. And thank you very much, by the way, for everyone's contribution and turning up today. I've enjoyed the conversation. If you want it, just ping me and let me know if you want the recording. I'll be very happy to share it if there's anything of value in there for you. Again, thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
See you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Jane.
Bye-bye, nice to see you.